So today I would like to tell you about certain possibilities for harmony that you can use in your music. You've probably only really used one form of harmony before, so there's a whole world of possibilities I would like you to know about. So let's take a look here. Types of harmonic possibilities. Right now in this lecture, I'm going to talk about just the vertical sonorities, which essentially means chords. We can easily break down into three types. Secundal, which is based on seconds. Secundal means seconds. Seconds, sevenths, ninths, such as this. Or etc. So seconds, sevenths, ninths. Tertian, based on thirds, sixths, and tenths. You're probably more aware of tertian. So, or here's another possibility, etc. So let's go in a little more detail about this. Secundal harmony. Secundal means second. And we know we can easily create chords via the cluster of neighboring pitches. These can either be a diatonic collection, a chromatic collection, and or taken from any other scale such as whole tone, octatonic, etc. So here's some diatonic ones here. Play that again. Yeah, that's quite pleasant, right? Another diatonic one here. Remember, you can be diatonic using, accidentals and naturals. And here's another one here. Maybe I'll arpeggiate it. You really should play through these yourself. I don't know how good this recording is, but I really want you to get these under your hands. Here's some chromatic collections. Now, this first one here, it's often very funny or ugly. Sounds like your cat stepped on the piano. But here's another one here. All right, that's pretty ugly, I would suppose. Or this one here. Let's see if I can play this easily with my hands. Yes. Okay, those three. And then here's some from other collections, like whole tone. Or something from an octatonic collection. Again, these are just subsets. A subset means you're taking a portion, not the whole thing. Here's the octatonic collection. And here's a pentatonic collection, and I have these little notes. Note that some scales, such as pentatonic by nature, include other intervals and seconds in the cluster, right? Because there's that gap. So there's a pentatonic cluster. Granted, we have that little gap there, but essentially that's still secundal harmony based on a pentatonic collection. Now, however, beyond the cluster, we can also use inversion. So inversion can mean the seventh, of course, and compound intervals. And the compound intervals would be the ninth and octaves above that. So the inversion can also be the seventh and octaves above that seventh, and the compound is like the ninth and all intervals above that. So here's such an example. We have that original cluster I played before. I can try separating it out into sevenths here, so that would be pretty much putting E on the bottom. It's a very different sound, right? Or I can put it in ninths, the next one. Quite a nice color, right? So see how it has a different sound to it when you start inverting it like that? And doing it on the compounds? Well, that's even more dynamic when you're dealing with the chromatic cluster. So we have this first chromatic cluster here. Right, that one that's a bit ugly. But if I listen, what happens if I turn it into sevenths? Now, it's still harsh, but it's actually not as funny sounding. It's more kind of dynamic sounding, right? And here's the ninths. Sorry. Oh, sorry, I didn't play it. There we go. Notice it has a much more resonant quality to it. It's not nearly as sounding like a mistake. It definitely has a different color, right? And some others here, like the whole tone collection, could be spread out like this. So, for example, we have, this one. You might have to count the ledger lines of like E, C, A, G. Right, so we could go like this. That's a nice little grouping of ninths of the whole tone collection. I'll do a grouping of sevenths of the octatonic collection. A little bit different sound. And like you could also have a combination of cluster and open voicings, of course, to do it. So this has a combination of sevenths and seconds, etc. So this one here sounds like this. That's still secundal harmony. So those are some things you can already do just using seconds, not just using them as neighboring intervals, but also spacing them out. And they all have distinctive sounds. Now I'm going to jump past tertian harmony for the time being because I want to talk about quartal quintal harmony first. Quartal means fourth, while quintal means fifth. All right, like quartet and quintet, similar idea. Even though they are inversions of each other, of course the fifth is the inversion of the fourth, they have a very different sound. Collections of stacked perfect fourths have a tension sound. So here's a common fourth sound. Or I can spread it out to this. Right. It's a very cool sound. It has a little bit of tension though. And in fact, I can spread it out to the aggregate. This word aggregate actually means all 12 notes. And as we know, the circle of fourths, etc., you can get all 12 notes. So I could spread it out like this, and it has a very nice sound. I obviously can't play it together with one hand, but I can certainly arpeggiate it for us here. That has a very interesting quality to it. Obviously, it's much nicer sounding than going, kind of just all 12 notes that way. If it's spread out this way, it certainly has a much this very brilliant sound to it. Now, the fifth is the inversion of the fourth. Now, because the perfect fifth is a very important interval in the overtone series, we'll talk about in a second, it has a completely different sound. Note, the perfect fourth isn't in the overtone series. You may not have known that, but we will talk about that a little later. But the fifth is. So the fifth has a very open sound to it. Kind of nice sound. Let me expand it a little more. Add some more notes to it. Very pleasant sound, right? In fact, the aggregate itself is quite pleasant sounding, even though it is all 12 notes. So let's take a look at this one. So I'm going to actually, you'll have to measure the ledger lines here. That's a low B, but so you play fifths, a full aggregate. Please go to a piano and play this yourself. as it has a really kind of wonderful resonance on an acoustic piano. You're not quite hearing it with my electric piano here all that well. So now let's talk about tritones. So the tritone itself is limited to 2 tones. You can't like build tritones on tritones. You just end up, with the same note because it's symmetrical, right? But it can be combined with other intervals to get some nice sounds. Gives it kind of some brilliance. So here's a common one here. You might almost sound like a jazz sonority. Right? Here's another one here. So that one's a perfect fourth and a tritone, right? And this one we have tritone, minor second, tritone, right here. And also, due to the pattern of perfect fourth and fifths, often it is combined with other intervals but still gives a quartal quintal flavor, right? And can also be used in compound intervals. That's what it says there, yeah. So this, of course, isn't a tritone, but you can notice this combination right here. Even though, yes, we have thirds and seconds in there, what you're really hearing is the... Yes, you hear the thirds and the second, but you hear a lot of perfect fourth and perfect fifths in that color. We will see this one come back, though, as something called a sus chord in tertian harmony as well. All right, now we're talking about tertian harmony. I actually saved that for last because there's a lot more to talk about with tertian harmony. It's based on thirds, sixths, tenths, etc., right? The sixth is the inversion of the third, the tenth is the compound. Tertian, meaning third, can be based on more varieties than you may realize. So you're all used to it being based on triads, right? Like this. And then the inversion. And then maybe a little bit more sophisticated where we double some notes, have some foundation, a little more open voicing. In fact, I say at the bottom there is, it is commonly accepted that tertian harmony can be placed in different voicings that result in other intervals coming from the tertian based, which can also result in secundal, quartal, quintal sonorities or sounding like other tertian inversions, right? So this one, of course, we do see some fourths and fifths, etc. in here, but, the predominant sonority is still tertian. We could have stacked or tall chords, continuing the pattern of building thirds, which is also called extended tertian harmony. So, for example, we can build up to the 13th there. So, root third, fifth, seventh, ninth, 11th. Oh, that's the 11th there. And, of course, we could also go all the way up to the 13th, right? And, you could have some other inversions of that, etc. So, in that inversion, you do get some seconds or a more spaced one like this one here, where we go like this, spacing it out. Again, it starts to resemble maybe some of the other combinations too when you start putting it in inversion, etc. These are all interrelated. I want to talk a little bit about pedal and added tone and polychords. So this first example is as of a pedal chord. So a pedal chord would be placing a triad with another note in the bass. Here's a very common one. So we have the D triad on the top with the G on the bottom. Sounds a lot like the composer Aaron Copland. Added tone chords, such as this one, which is an E major triad with an add 6. This is common in jazz to do something like this. Now you'll note that's equivalent to a C sharp minor minor 7 in first inversion. It's just this. So depending on how you think of it, it could just be a 7th chord inversion. But another way to think of it would be a triad with an added 6th. And then we have something called a polychord. A polychord is a combination of 2 different types of triads at once. So we have E major with D minor on the bottom. So we have E major up here, and then D major on the bottom. And together that sounds like... to sound a lot like a 13th chord with a missing tone. Yes, but that's another concept. All right. And the intensity of a polychord depends on what you're putting together. This one's actually quite a nice, sorry. This one's quite nice sounding. You know, you could just have this one, or you could have, or, so it depends on really what chords you decide to put together in that combination. And those could be an inversion, etc. So triads, arguably the most common sort of chord, literally describes 2/3. Normally it's defined stacking only major and minor thirds, not augmented or diminished thirds, etc. This results in only 2 diatonic-based major and minor triads and 2 chromatic-based, the diminished and augmented triads. So you know these well. Major, minor, and then we have diminished, and then we have augmented. Right? Note, due to the nature of the overtone harmonic partial series, where the perfect octave, fifth, and 12th are strong sonorities, major and minor triads can still be identified when leaving out the 5th of the chord. So if you don't know what this is, you might have heard of this before. Oh, let's start playing surf here. Keeps going up more microtonally. That's the notes that generally resonate in any given timbre or pitch. You'll notice this tone is technically a quarter tone, so sometimes it might be expressed on a piano as either an A natural or an A flat. I did it as A natural. These are the tones that are ingrained in sounds, and how these harmonics rings defines on how someone sounds. I should note, though, it is not equal tempered, so it's not really exactly the way I'm playing it. But if you notice the strength of so many fifths, that we naturally hear that fifth when we play a chord. And so in order to get diminished or augmented, we really need to play that flat 5 or that sharp 5. All right. You note here there's no 4th in the series. I don't know if you noticed that. There's only an F sharp. So anyway, that's why chords such as this one, we still think of a major third. You can put it in inversion. I mean, we still think of a major triad, sorry. We still think of this as sounding like a major triad, even though we've left out the 5th. Same thing with this one. And then if we look at this one, we still think of a minor triad. Right? Even though we're leaving off the 5th. And it's because of that overtone series. Also, the 3rd is in the overtone series. Very strong. So it's a coupling that really stands out in these combinations. Continuing with tertian harmony, extended tertian harmony, commonly called stacked or tall chords, is simply continuing the thirds beyond the triad to the 7th, 9th, 11th, 13th, etc. They basically be diatonic or chromatic, and subchromatic chords we could call synthetic or symmetrical. They're all essentially chromatic. Synthetic kind of means you made it up. Symmetrical, we saw some of those where they are symmetrical from top to bottom, like whole tone, which is whole, 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 until we get back up to the octave again, or octatonic, which is whole, half, whole, half, whole, half, whole, half, or half, whole, half, whole, half, whole, until we get to the octave again. That would be something that's symmetrical. You remember this from the scale chart I gave you. Note, although used exclusively as predominant, like the 5/7, 4/7, etc., or dominant 5/7, 7 diminished 7, function in common practice tonality before the 20th century, at the end of the 19th century and beyond, starting with composers like Satie, Debussy, and Ravel, etc., and becoming commonplace in jazz and pop music, these chords can also take on the function as tonic. So 7th, 9th, 11th, 13th chords are now accepted as being the tonic harmony. If you listen to pop music or jazz, the 1 can even be a 7th chord. Remember if you play something like a jazz progression. progression, you feel like that is the tonic chord, right? So it loses its function. This is mostly due to the adoption of equal temperament, by the way.